Hi. So I wanted to make a video. This is in regards to the whole kind of industry VR news that's been happening lately with the Meta layoffs and Meta in the popular kind of discussion and discourse. People say Meta are pulling out of VR entirely. So I want to kind of cover some of my thoughts on this because I'm a filthy centrist that tries to, I guess, see things from kind of all the angles that I can. So I'll probably not really get any goodwill from people with this video. I might kind of annoy everyone, but hopefully not. Hopefully some people will see kind of where I'm coming from in this. So initially, what I'm going to talk about might sound like I'm being defensive of Meta in some way, which I want to kind of really establish that that's not what I'm going for. That's not the case here. I'm just trying to somewhat present information in a way that's maybe a bit more balanced with kind of the reality of what's going on, as opposed to just the kind of following along with the quite deserved dislike of Meta in general and how they've been within the space. So that kind of, I feel like, can often color the discussion and kind of push it towards a certain narrative. This video also was prompted by an article that went up today by Ian Hamilton on Upload VR. That was a repost of a letter that John Carmack wrote to kind of the Oculus team back in 2015, which I had never had read before, but it was really interesting to see his thoughts on that and kind of how those line up a decade later and how spot on he was about a lot of things. So this is completely unscripted. This is just random thoughts, but let's get into it. So the first thing I want to discuss is Meta. If you're not familiar with the news, I'm sure you are if you're here, but Meta laid off 10% of Reality Labs staff. So Reality Labs at the time of the layoffs hired or was about 15,000 people. So they laid off about 1,500. From what I've read and from what I can see and from what I've heard, the vast majority of that was within first-party game publishing within Oculus Studios, I think as it's still called. But yeah, within Meta as a whole. So the focus there was kind of gutting all these studios that they bought, and then that they released a couple of games with, not all of them, but some of them released games, and they got them, and they're pulling back from that first party space. A few things to establish here. I've seen a couple of different things, people being like, oh, it was 10% of Meta, which is basically the whole of Meta Reality Labs. That's not true. It was 10% of Meta Reality Labs. So I think it's fair to say that Meta is kind of obviously still in VR. I don't think they're going anywhere anytime soon. The narrative has been that Meta is pulling out of VR entirely and that they're going to focus on AR wholeheartedly and fully. The reality is that up until today, the majority of funding has always been in AR and not VR within Reality Labs. It was split somewhat evenly from time to time. Sometimes it swung quite highly in favor of AR from what I've heard, but typically the breakdown, if you kind of average it out over the years, seems to be about 50% AR, 40% VR, and then 10% metaverse, which I think pretty much covered Horizon Worlds. So when you see articles saying like 72 billion burnt on Horizon Worlds, and then they're showing a picture of this weird blob Zuck in front of a blob Eiffel Tower, that's not true at all. Realistically, they have spent a lot on Horizon Worlds, like a lot of money for what it's been, and that's a whole other discussion where the efficiency within Meta and what they have achieved with the resources that they have is, in some ways, there's been some very impressive things, like look at Boba 3 and Tiramisu and these kind of research these research prototypes for hardware. There's been some really impressive stuff, and then silicon carbide waveguide, that stuff's like really, really impressive. But overall, in terms of if you look at where VR is in that regard, I don't think we've seen quite the progress that we would have liked to have seen, and things aren't as fleshed out. Stuff that would be touched on in this letter from John Carmack, for example, where he talks about bringing 2D applications in sooner, back in 2015. Like, we're only starting to see 2D applications really become a common thing on the Quest platform now, a decade later, and that's, you know, on an Android operating system basis. So 2D apps were supported out of the box essentially. And of course there is 2D apps in the sense of like the settings panel is a 2D application, but in terms of just having 2D apps that you can pull up in space and kind of, you know, I suppose use as spatial computing. So with where the narrative is right now is that Meta's pulled out of VR entirely. I don't think this is true. I think what has happened is that first party gaming, so this idea of funding a large AAA game, Batman, Asgard's Wrath 2, Deadpool, funding a large one each year as a means to pull in people into the Quest platform, that just hasn't worked. People always in online discussion are always talking about like, we need AAA VR, we need, you know, large games, whatever, but that, you know, Meta have tried to provide that and it doesn't seem to have really pulled in the audience like in the way that you might expect it to. That's not to point fingers at gamers and be like, oh, you know, why are you not buying this, why are you not getting in, because I think a lot of the people that say they want AAA and they want big games are also likely, you know, a lot of them are probably on PC VR and stuff, so they're not too interested in a AAA game running on a mobile chipset. It's kind of in a way a bit conflicting to be like a AAA game on a mobile chipset. Not to say that it's impossible or anything, but in terms of, you know, the graphical fidelity that you might expect of a AAA game, it's a hard sell, it's a hard push. So I think what has happened is Meta has pulled back out of that space and they're not really funding AAA anymore. What I think about where this leaves the industry in terms of VR today, I think it's actually pretty good. I think it's a pretty positive look forward. A lot of people have talked about how Meta has distorted the market, and, you know, particularly, let's say, a lot of these studios that they bought up, these were up and coming studios that had released titles that were like really compelling, really good back in the early days, and then Meta bought them up, and some of them did go on to release, you know, great titles again later, but it wasn't in the same way. And I think if you're being bankrolled, there is kind of a shift in dynamics and a shift in culture, most likely. So you end up having studios that, if they're not financially doing as well or not, you know, meeting the overall, it's not even about financially doing in this case, it's more about the overall objectives of the platform of Quest, trying to get in users. So the studios end up losing agency where they can't be, you know, okay, we're going to kind of reduce ourselves, be scrappy, focus on, you know, pivoting or making a new game that really catches people. They don't have that agency because they're now within a larger organization where their existence is not to be developers to make a great game. Their existence is more so to be a catalyst to try and bring users into the platform. So then the studios just get shut down, as opposed to, you know, had those studios not been picked up, you could say that they could very likely have shut down, you know, much sooner and not released any additional titles. But it's not unfeasible that they could have, you know, went on to kind of grow more organically and like build up a user base and keep engaged with that user base and everything else. So it's quite mixed, but the way I kind of see it is that Meta has been dumping huge amounts of money into VR. They have been bankrolling VR for a large part, and people have very mixed feelings about that. I think it would have been good, of course, had VR organically grown from the beginning and just kind of you know, moved along more organically. I think they might be on the way out, but not in the sense that they're deliberately pulling back and pulling out. I think that just, it might go that way because they keep, I don't know, just making really, really strange choices, really ill-guided decisions. And John Carmack's letter, I think, kind of actually shines some light on that 10 years ago. And I feel like a lot of those issues probably haven't been addressed. They're systemic, they're within the administration, they're from the top down. But what I will say is that a lot of that money that's gone in has, in many ways, like look at the XR line of chips from Snapdragon. I doubt those would have existed without in, you know, Meta coming along and funding a lot of that. Of course, you do have like the Steam Frame coming out with a Snapdragon that isn't an XR line headset chipset, and you also had headsets before that, like the Quest 1, for example, was a Snapdragon 835. It wasn't an XR specific chip, but the XR specific chip series does I feel like make lower the barrier of entry for a lot of others. So it is a worthwhile addition. But where I'm going with that is that I think a lot of the funding that Meta's put in has actually helped grow the foundation of VR technically in many ways, where there are standards established now. There are, a lot of tool sets that have been fleshed out. Best practices have been, developed and acknowledged. I think there's a lot of merit to that, a lot of benefit to that. I don't think that stuff was like a gift from Meta to the VR industry. I think that was kind of a byproduct of Meta just wanting to plow on ahead and these things needing to exist. On the bright side, then, it means that funding, I don't think, just falls to the side and falls to waste. For the future of VR, I think organic growth will come. PC VR, usage levels, if you're looking at the Steam charts and stuff like that, are still not great, but I do feel like there is a very well-established VR base on PC in particular, that it's a healthy market that people can survive in, but it's niche, it's small. But that also leans into the whole thing of like, when people talk about VR going mainstream, I feel like the expectations are completely ridiculous and out of just any realm of reality. People's expectations for VR to go mainstream seems to be that it has to like reach the level of laptops at the minimum. It has to be, ideally phones where everyone's got a VR headset. I think a lot of that comes from the fact that people see VR as a new medium. So they expect a medium to be established at a very high level with high usage, as opposed to the example that I make is like 3D printers, for example, and drones. People aren't going to say that those aren't mainstream, but in terms of the amount of people that own them on a consumer level, the amount of people that use them at a consumer level, I don't think they're actually, that totally off. Like 3D printers, for example, the amount of people that own and use them would be a hell of a lot closer to VR than it would be to phones or laptops, if that makes sense. But I don't think anyone would say that 3D printing is not like mainstream, or it's not established, that it's not valid. So I think a lot of its expectations. We're also only about realistically 10 years into modern consumer VR. People talk about, there was VR in the 90s and stuff like that, but that was a different era. That was a whole different time. That's like the way, another analogy would be like electric cars started in the 1890s. That doesn't mean that electric cars today have been developed over the course of the last 130 years. So VR really is only about one console generation of life in existence right now, or like being, in the consumer market. So it's still really, really early days. Vast majority of people are not willing to put a brick on their face. That's just a fact. But that's getting addressed. We seem to be reaching that era of where that is actually getting addressed. I think the future of VR is actually quite good and healthy. I don't think VR needs Meta to survive. I think VR has been bankrolling a lot of it, but that's also been distorting it, like many people have said. I don't think Meta are pulling out of VR. They're reducing their focus, particularly on first-party VR gaming, which just has not pulled in users like they expected it to. It seemed to have been working a bit with the Batman game. Asgard's Wrath 2, I don't think that really moved the needle much. Deadpool also hasn't moved the needle, which you would have expected it to, but it didn't seem to have the same sort of, like, it had a big marketing push, but it wasn't at the same level as Batman, I guess. But also Batman had, it was being a beloved gaming series that came back and such. But also I think people just kind of, Deadpool's coming at a time where people are kind of struggling with a lot of expenses and the cost of living and everything else. So I think there's a whole mishmash of things there. But realistically, the first party game approach I don't think was working, and I think they've realized that and they've pulled back on that. That doesn't I don't think that means that they're pulling out of VR. People always talk about Quest 4 being cancelled and stuff like that, but from what we've heard, it's Quest 4 has changed in what it's going to be. It's not going to be a subsidized headset anymore, which means that the design language there and the approach fundamentally is going to change for what that headset is. Then you've got their super light headset coming out the start of next year apparently, which will be likely not have controllers. It'll not be gaming focused at all. It'll be media focused. So what I want to look at now is I'm just going to read out some portions of this letter from John Carmack. So it's titled Oculus Strategy Long, and he talks about a few different things, but there's some particularly interesting points. At this stage, Gear VR was coming out. There was no standalone Quest, or even Oculus Go wasn't on the agenda just yet, and their focus is still very much on PC VR and where that was going to go. He makes a point, for example, about Oculus OS. So I'll just read this first. The argument goes something like, all important platforms have their own OS. We want VR to be an important platform, therefore we need our own OS. This is both confusing correlation with causation and just wrong. Facebook is an important platform that doesn't have its own OS. When you push hard enough, the question of what specifically would we do with our own kernel that we can't get from an existing platform turns out to be not much. So I'm guessing this is focused more on the PC side of things, but I think it still applies even with the Quest line of headsets, where there was a period of time where Meta was dumping a lot of money into trying to develop their own VR OS as opposed to using Android as a foundation, and they abandoned that. I think there would have been merits to their own OS, of course, but I think that was probably just biting off too much. You're talking too long of a time scale really there. So going back to Android made a lot of sense. Obviously Meta is really big, they can work on a lot of things in parallel, but it does seem like a lot of things are very fragmented, and there doesn't seem to be a real clear cohesive vision. It's just there's so much money being thrown at this problem, but money, you will get results, but the results won't be cohesive. The results won't be like a logical kind of reasonable thing that's been thought out with passion involved. And the most important thing is where he goes on to later talk about kind of some of the people that are at the tops of the platform. The next part I'll read out is this. So he talks about acceptance of non-interactive media. This is still grudging, as noted by the interactive bullet point in our official strategy presentation at the town hall, and Brendan's derisive use of Viewmaster when talking about Cardboard. That's Google Cardboard. But most now agree that it has an important place. People like photos and video. You could go so far as to say it drives the consumer internet, and I think Oculus still underestimates this, which is why I'm happy that Douglas Purdy's VR video team is outside the Oculus chain of command. So he talks about this acceptance of non-interactive media, which is wild because we're only now seeing, Meta has embraced it, of course, to some extent before, like there's Oculus TV and a few things, but there still hasn't been this like proper push towards like a media device. Oculus Go, I guess you could argue, was a media device, but it's still, from my experience with it, it was more focused on gaming. So I want to read this other section, consumer software culture. So he says, we need to become a consumer software shop. The Oculus founders came from a tool company background, which has given us an SDK and demos development style that I don't think best suits our goals. That's still very much the case. Oculus also plays to the press rather than to the customers that have bought things from us, and it is going to be an adjustment to get there. Unfortunately, I don't think they've gotten there, and this is 10 years ago. Having an entire research division that is explicitly tasked with staying away from products is also challenging, and is probably going to get more so as product people crunch. Not quite sure what he means there, but anyway, moving on. Talk of software at Oculus has been largely aspirational rather than practical. That's very important, and I, again, do not think that has significantly changed. I could be wrong, but it really seems the way. What we want versus what we can deliver. And Meta, like, I'm not trying to say haven't delivered, but they have delivered plenty, but that idea of what we want versus what we can deliver does seem to be very, very apparent as an end user. So if it's coming from someone within the company 10 years ago and it still feels that way as an end user 10 years later, I don't think this advice was taken on board. In fact, I feel like this advice was either not taken on board or was taken as an affront and directly avoided within Meta. Continuing. Talk of software at Oculus has largely been... Oh, sorry, I said that. I was exasperated at the talk about Oculus quality as if it was a real thing instead of a vague goal. I do have concerns that at the top of the supply chain of command, Nate and Brendan haven't shipped consumer software. So he's directly calling out colleagues here. And I don't have an opinion on Nate and Brendan and, them having shipped consumer software, but it's just, I think there's probably a lot you can read into there, and again, it still feels like that's likely the case today. Everyone knows that we aren't going to run out of money and be laid off in a few months. That gives us the freedom to experiment and explore, looking for compelling experiences and discarding things that don't seem to be working out. In theory, that sounds ideal. In practice, it means we have a lot of people working on things that are never going to contribute any value to our customers. And that is true. There's a lot of kind of pie in the sky stuff that goes on. Stuff that's like, again, I think stuff that will be kind of more beneficial for the wider VR space rather than Meta themselves, which is really weird. I think you take the good with the bad, I suppose. There is like, research, particularly in hardware, and there's plenty of software research too that Meta does that does kind of go out to the wider VR space and industry, and it's their attempt, I suppose, at legitimizing the space and kind of kickstarting it, which I think we can kind of take as a positive. It's just I don't think it's going to really lead Meta to where they want to be. I think they're kind of just basically giving stuff to other people, but while also kind of being arbiters within the industry and kind of gatekeeping in some ways, which I'm sure many people, particularly within Meta and stuff, would say is harsh because they've been very generous in many ways. But I think the reality is that, yeah, that kind of artificial dumping of money and kind of be trying to like put themselves at the center of it, I don't know. Next he says, for example, I am unhappy with Nate's decision to not commit to any kind of social component for the consumer launch this year. I'm going to try to do something anyway, but it means swimming against the tide. So that was very interesting to hear that there wasn't a social component back then with the CV1. I think Meta obviously has introduced a lot of social components and they have been focused on that aspect, but perhaps not in some ways, not in the way that you would want. Like, for example, personally, amongst people, if you want wider adoption amongst people I know that do VR but they're not like VR enthusiasts or particularly hardcore or anything like that, they tend to, the most obvious things they would do is hop on and walk about mini golf or big screen VR, where we just sit and watch a show and talk to each other in kind of a small space. I think for those people trying to get into like Horizon Worlds or even just anything a bit more interactive is a struggle. So I think there's a lot of merit to this kind of kind of more passive media consumption with telepresence. It really does add a lot of value, but I feel like there hasn't been a significant focus on that from Meta. Like it has existed on the platform, in terms of like big screen VR and stuff like that, but it really needed to be a native thing. And then one thing I started using a while back was when YouTube Co-Watch was added in, but it's so buggy. I haven't even tried it in the last couple of months because every time I used it with a friend, it was just unbelievably frustrating. It just was not worth the headache. This also was a very interesting section. Abandon made for VR or go away attitude. So abandon that attitude of made for VR or get out. The iPhone was a phone. Many people would say it wasn't actually a great phone, but it subsumed the functionality of something that everyone had and used, and that was important for adoption. If it had been delivered as an iPod Touch first, it would have been far less successful, and one step further, if it wasn't also an iPod, it would have been another obscure PDA. Oculus' position has been hostile to apps that aren't specifically designed for VR, and I think that is a mistake. Completely agreed. A lot of the value I get, let's say with the Vision Pro, a lot of the value I get isn't VR native or, spatial computing native apps. It's just having the apps that I already use within that space and being able to have the flexibility then to have other apps that are, spatially focused. In some ways, as a VR enthusiast, you would want everything to be VR first. You would want all your applications to like really flesh out a VR mode, and that sounds great, but it's been 10 years and like these things take a long time, like to figure out, right, how do we take Excel, or Google Sheets and turn that into something spatial. Eventually these things will have spatial components to them that will actually be useful, but they'll have to come up organically. You can't just sit down and really force these things. It's more so people will start finding ways that they want to do it. Someone will hack something together. It'll become evident that is something that people actually want, and then that gets expanded on and established. But for now, it's totally valid to just have those as 2D apps. And of course, Meta does have those things now, but the point is that this was a decade ago, and it took so long to get over this mindset. And it's weird because it is a VR enthusiast mindset that I feel like I should be celebrating, but it's also just, it's too rapid. It's too quick. It's like that is the future for sure, but we need to get the basics down. We need to get people in. So, you know, we can't go there and like to block that off, to be like, no, it has to be the future right now. Like that is just doesn't make sense. It's a bizarre way to approach things. Where the hell was I? Yeah, we do not have a flood of AAA or even A-level content, and I don't think it will magically appear as soon as we yell CV1 at the top of our lungs. So obviously they threw a load of money at it to try and make it happen, and we've seen a decade later that they were like, didn't work, we're pulling the plug on that part. They're not pulling the plug on VR like a lot of people seem to think. So then he says there are a number of things that can help. Encourage limited VR mode for existing games. That's a huge one. I really do think that that's something that I don't know why that hasn't been approached more. You know, even just as experimental modes in games, you know, encourage games to have a VR mode. And I think people might listen to VR enthusiasts a bit too much, because obviously we wanted to have 6-DoF controls, we wanted to be in the game and be able to interact properly, but we are a niche, a very, very, very small niche. So the wider audience, I think, having a lightweight headset where they can put it on and just be that bit more immersed but still play the game as they would normally, I think there's a lot of value to that, and a lot of people would be onboarded through something like that. But we do kind of have, you know, and as this mentality that was actually Meta, funny enough, or Oculus Studios at the time, where there was kind of a purist approach where that wasn't, you know, that's not VR, that's not enough. So yeah, there's a lot of trickiness there. We should make first-class support for running conventional 2D apps in VR. Huge. And this was on PC that he was talking about. This wasn't, you know, a standalone platform just yet. And we should support non-net application streaming on mobile. So that would have been like your Google Sheets, Google, you know, like any of those kind of web apps. It is going to be a long time before we have high quality VR applications for everything that people want to do. A long, long time. Yes. 2D applications floating in VR will fill a valuable role, and we've seen that. We have, you know, the Vision Pro released 2 years ago, and that was a major focus, and there are people, look at, sadly it's Bradley going ballistic, 20 windows around you, you know, people do love it. 2D applications floating in VR will fill a valuable role, especially as we move towards stretching between multiple resident applications. Even driver intercept applications, 3D VR-fi native applications may eventually have a place. UEVR, yeah, that definitely came true. It is technically feasible to deliver the full comfortable VR experience from a naive application in some cases. Yeah. Although I think he probably wasn't talking so much about games there, he was talking about just applications more broadly. So anyway, that article, I really think it's worth reading it. Oh, actually, the very last thing I'll say, there was one really interesting point where he talked about we have a problem here. It would be hard for the CEO of a sailboat company to be enthusiastic and genuine if they always got seasick whenever they went out, but Brendan is in exactly that position. My Minecraft work is a good example. By its very nature, it is terrible from a comfort position. Not only does it have navigation, but there is a lot of parabolic bounding up and down. Regardless, I've played more hours in it than any other VR experience except cinema. Brendan suggested that there might be a better made for VR Minecraft that was stationary and third person. This was frightening to hear, because it showed just how wide the gulf was between our views of what a great VR game should be. God! Playing with Lego blocks can be fun, but running for your life while lost on the ground is moving. God, like the fact that you had people at top, and I'm not trying to attack this Brendan lad or whatever, but you had people at the top that, you know, VR is still early. Motion sickness hasn't been solved. It's better now, but it hasn't been solved, so there are going to be people that are sick. But like, you can't have someone running the show that in its current state, you know, physically is opposed to the medium. It's absolutely crazy. Now, you do want people like that within the company to some extent, because you want to have, you know, representatives of like the wider population and such, but you know, a lot of those people should be in testing, being like, how are we going to get over this issue? As you know, my God, what a wild thing to hear. And it's, I think it kind of, I've heard so many stories about that, you know, where people just don't use the headsets within the company. And then you look at the Vision Pro and you can tell that the people developing Vision Pro really do use the headset. You know, the features that they put in are features that you actually want. Like, they're features that make sense, that would come to your mind while using the product, as opposed to, coming up with ideas externally on a whiteboard, being like, wouldn't this be good within this medium from my perspective that I haven't validated through real world usage of my own. Crazy. So yeah, sorry, this is totally meandering. Probably, to be honest, probably a lot of bullshit. People probably, if you're still here, God help you. Why are you still listening to someone ramble on like this? But good for you, good for me, good for no one probably. But yes, the real point I was just making was that I think VR is in a really good place, actually. I think we're so early. I think the foundation has been laid, and I think Meta, at least from the gaming side of things, kind of pulling back, probably will actually be a good thing overall. I really want to drive home though that they are not leaving VR, and I think a lot of people were nearly hopeful that they are. They're not, okay? And that's good and bad in many ways, but I think them pulling back from gaming at least will allow what is the most established use case for the medium to have some more breathing room to organically grow. Then in terms of the wider space, people being like, they're shifting all their focus to AR, and I guess they are following that, ramping that up more, but AR has always been funded more within Meta than VR. It has always been their main focus in the long term, in my opinion, and I don't think they see VR necessarily just as a stepping stone. I don't think it's just hedging their bets. Like, I think they see it as another medium, and that they will coexist, and there will be crossover, and there will be coexistence there or whatever, but yeah, they're not leaving the VR space. AR has always been a major focus, so that hasn't really changed. This hasn't been a shift to AR. Really, what this news is just they've abandoned making games themselves, and we're not going to get games like Deadpool and Asgard's Wrath 2, but at the same time we probably will have studios that aren't kind of so dependent on Meta, and things might hopefully become more organic. But yeah, I'm quite optimistic. I'm biased, of course. Like, I'm a VR enthusiast. I love this medium. I love this space. I love everything about it, pretty much. So I obviously want it to be true that we're in a good place and that it's going forward. But I really think, like, there's millions of people in VR now. It's established. It's an established niche, so it's got huge amounts of room to grow. But the idea of like, VR is dead, it's like there's so many companies making headsets. There's so much going on in the space all the time, and it's not all just Meta focused. They're not bootstrapping absolutely everything by any stretch. So I think the future's positive. I think things are looking good. I'm excited, and the news this week is disheartening in many ways, and I really feel for anyone that was directly affected by it, like that actually lost a job. That really sucks. However, I do think for the VR space industry and gaming in particular overall, I think this probably is a positive thing. And I don't know what people will agree or disagree. Maybe I haven't really said as much as I thought I was going to say in this video. I'm rambling a lot, but I'll leave it at that. Thanks very much for listening. Hope you're all keeping good. Keep your chin up. VR is awesome. Blah 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 blah. I don't know. I don't have an outro. That's it. I'm done. Bye.